The door to the schoolhouse stood open to the wind, and when the giant stepped through it, the room shrank around him. He filled the frame, broad shoulders under a dusk-dark coat, a brim tipped low, a shadow like a cloud thrown across the chalked slate and the row of small desks. The children, blackboard slate in hand, looked up like birds startled from a hedge. Abigail Wyn, who had spent most of her 33 years measuring the world in slates and sums, set her piece of chalk down and found that the line she had been drawing across a lesson plan broke into thin white dust under her fingers. He did not apologize for filling the doorway. He set his hat on the teacher's desk and looked at her with an honesty that was almost rude in its bluntness. He had a face weathered like leather and a voice that carried the low, simple certainty of someone used to saying what needed saying. "I need a wife," he said. "You need strong sons to guard your winters." The sentence was not a question. It landed on the high rafters, and the wind outside answered it by turning the school bell on its rope, making it sing once, twice, a clear, stubborn note that seemed to say time had entered the room. Abigail did not laugh. She had been alone a long time by custom and choice. Redfern Ridge had been a good place for a woman to keep her head about her. The schoolhouse, one room, clapboard paint peeling at the corners, the bell above the door slightly off key, was where she held a small empire. The children's faces mapped out the small future she kept with a careful hand. Sarah Mitchell, who read aloud with an anxious, hand-smoothing manner. Tommy Fletcher, who nailed his eyes to her wristwatch as if time might be won back. And the rest, the ones she fed into sums and spelling and the slow ethics of community life. She liked that order. It fit in her like the pocket of an apron. Still, the man in the doorway held an enormity that made the accustomed lines of her life look fragile. Boaz Cutter's hands were the size of small boards. When he moved, things settled. A chair scraped, the light through the window changed. He smelled faintly of saddle soap and winter wool, of horsehair and earth that had been broken by plow. He was a man who had made his living by the seasons and by keeping men and cattle where they belonged. "You need strong sons to guard your winters," he said again, softer now. "And I need someone who keeps the house straight and reads when the nights hold longer." Abigail tightened her lips, the motion small and private. It was not for the children to see anyone unsettle the order of the world, least of all their teacher. She told herself she would be plain with him because plainness was a language she knew well. "How do you reckon that will work?" she asked. Her voice had the even cadence of someone used to asking the next reasonable question. Boaz smiled once, without humor, and reached into his coat. He drew out 2 papers folded together and laid them on her desk with the plain care of someone handing over a tool. One was a short contract, written in a man's hand, neat cursive, practical signatures planned at the bottom. The other was a smaller sheet, with rules scrawled on it in pencil. The keeping of rooms separate until vows were given, the preservation of her position at the school, that she would attend church on Sundays if she wished, that the household goods would stay hers until she consented otherwise. "You'll have your school," he said. "You'll have your books. You'll keep your name if you want." "Miss Wyn has kept her name for 33 years, Abigail said, the phrase carrying both her age and what she had built within it. "Why now?" "Because winters come sharp on this ridge," he said. "Because men put claims on land they never owned, and fires happen, and men die. I don't pretend to be a man of letters. I do know how to make a fence. I do not know how to make peace with women. I need a wife who'll mind the house and set things right. You need, well," he tapped the paper with a thumb like it was a compass. "You need sons, or you need someone to make the place harder to take." There was no flatter, no gilded proposal. Boaz spoke as though he were setting out stock for sale, and also offering a shelter for one who might prefer shelter to the open wind. Abigail thought of winters, the long gray months when the road to town was a rumor of tracks, when the stove in her small parsonage held the only steady warmth for many miles. She thought of the whispered measures people took to keep their names safe, alliances, family ties, promises sealed in ink. She thought of the way Mrs. Henderson had looked at her over the church pew the week before, the thin smile that was sympathy and something else, and how the town could be a hard and measuring mirror. The children watched like a bank of small, waiting faces. The bell above the door swung, then stilled. The wind pressed against the clapboards with a slow, distasteful patience. Abigail placed her hand on the contract the way she would on a slate, studying it, feeling its weight. She read the lines, the practical arrangements, the signatures of neighbors who would witness.
the clause that allowed for a separation if either desired in a year. Simple words meant to keep two lives unequal from becoming a fight. There was no flourish, no attempt to soften. It was a bargain, and Abigail could see both its shelter and its strings. "Will everyone know?" she asked. "They see what needs seeing," Boaz said. "They'll talk anyway. If folks want to read my name in ink beside yours, they'll find something to say. But that's better than men taking what's not theirs while an empty house waits." Abigail looked around the room at the children, at the slate with neat letters she had scratched into it earlier that day.
She imagined them with other teachers, or without a teacher at all, should the winds come and take the roof off the school when no one stood to hold them. She imagined the little sphere of her life rolling away like a coin dropped in a gutter. For 3 nights, she did not decide. She kept to the small rituals, a pot of stew on the stove, ledger-scratched lists of names and supplies, and in the evenings she read. She read weather reports from the county, letters from the bookbinder in Cheyenne, and an old volume of country poetry that Boaz admitted, with a sheepishness he never did show in other things, he had found comfort in when the nights made his hands ache. She read for the precise reason she had always read, to know how the world named itself when it moved, and whether the name might be true. The town took its measure. Mrs. Patterson stopped by with a tin of molasses cookies and the quickest of questions, a tilt in her voice. Mrs. Henderson came with an embroidered cloth and said, the cloth held between 2 hands, "It will be more convivial for you, Abigail, to have company." The minister offered the congregational blessing quietly, more a nod than a sermon, and Reverend Matthews, who valued order above curiosity, clasped his hands and said he would stand as witness if that was what she chose. There were those who softened the edges, the way the banker's wife nodded at Abigail in the store, as if to say that a woman could be stronger when shadowed by a husband's name. There were others who sharpened them. A man at the post rumored that Cutter's sudden offer signaled something to be bought, some bargain struck under the barns in the winter moon. Rumor is a hand that massages a story until it takes a shape the town can carry. Sometimes that shape is kinder than the thing underneath. Sometimes it is crueler. Abigail sat on the wooden bench in front of her stove and considered the papers again. She measured the clauses as she had measured the children's arithmetic. Does this add to safety? Does this subtract from dignity? She liked that the contract kept her school. She liked that it provided neighbors to sign as witnesses. She liked that Boaz's hand was steady and certain. Yet there was a sluice of the old pride, 33 years of self-sufficiency, and the knowledge that she had chosen it. To accept this was to place herself under a male authority that was not itself monstrous, but which might in time ask more than she was willing to give. In the end, she thought of the bell. Not the church bell, which pealed solemnly on Sunday mornings, nor the merchant's dinner bell, but the little school bell that hung above the clapboard door and called the children in from a pasture, the bell she could ring with her own hand. It was small and simple, and it worked by a tug of determination. She decided she would not change the bell's sound for anyone. She told Boaz that if she chose to marry, she would keep the school and the right to call it. He took the promise as he took most promises, practically, not passionately, and with a slow, approving nod, said it would be so. When she signed the contract, she did it with a hand that did not tremble. She signed her name Abigail Wyn, as she had always written it, and watched the ink hold its line. Boaz signed his name in a larger hand and folded the paper into his pocket, as if it were a tool he might need. The witnesses sat beneath the solemnity of shared necessity. Reverend Matthews, a lean farmer named Harlan, who ran cattle on the South Bend, and Mrs. Henderson, who cried a little, though she did not know why. The town turned its face at the sight of the signatures, measured what it meant, and set to talking. The wedding was the sort of thing the Ridge made of many small gestures. There was an exchange of vows, spoken not in florid promise, but in practical truth, to keep the house warm, to raise livestock honestly, to keep the school through harvests and snows. Abigail wore a dress the color of riverstone that she had saved against this sort of necessity. She pinned a small bouquet of wild asters to her bodice, because Boaz, who never had bought flowers before, showed up at the parsonage with a handful of weeds he had called pretty. The congregation in the little church wiped their hands and said the words because the town likes a certainty, and because social order is a thing practiced like prayer in the frontier life. They did not move in together with the breathless, household-flipping grandeur of ballads. Boaz's house, low-ceilinged and full of honest shelves with jars and nails and a place for boots,
offered her a room with its own small window, and for the first weeks they kept separate beds. It was a courtesy to two people unversed in cohabitation, and it made room for dignity. Abigail continued to teach. She kept the school ledger under a neat pile in a box labeled with her hand, and Boaz rode away at dawn and came back when the cows were counted. They dined together sometimes, their plates filling with stew and bread, and other nights they sat with a book between them while the stove made a small kingdom of light. Small things welded the house and comforted Abigail. She found letters of his from years ago, postcards with loose pensiveness disguised as jokes, and she discovered that Boaz knew the names of stars. He read poetry badly, in a way that made the words honest and not theatrical, and Abigail found herself reading out loud from the volumes she kept on the shelf. He listened as if these lines were new ground, and he was only now learning the lay of it. Sometimes when the light over the stove was thin, he would lift her hand and press his knuckle to her palm in a small, plain gesture, the merest touch of affection, as if to register what was theirs for now. She liked how he mended a fence without complaint. She liked, too, the way he kept his rifle clean and his temper cleaner.
He taught her how to tend a garden by rows, how to coax carrots from ground that looked too stubborn to yield. He did not interfere with her schoolroom. When the children pressed questions about math and geography, he would nod and say, "Go to Miss Wyn, she can tell you what's true." The town, watching, softened at the sight of the two of them arm in arm at Sunday services, Abigail's hand tucked in the crook of his. That small public intimacy did not feel like a theft of her dignity. Instead, it felt like a new way of standing where people could see them and know that the house had hands. Yet even as their days accreted small joys, the horizon kept its old line of trouble. Marcus Blackwood's name had always been a notch in the town's oral ledger. He was a man with a smoother face and a wealthier gait, a neighboring rancher whose herd held broader acreage and who wore a smile that could measure a man like a trade. He had land north of Boaz's fence, and he had kept himself present in the right corners, banking ledgers and quiet promises. People thought him clever in the way men who wanted things they did not have to take quietly are clever. One evening at the church supper, the kind of gathering where gossip settles like cream on milk, Blackwood asked aloud about the northern range. The question was casual. The crack of his voice was pleasant and practiced. He spoke of an old deed, of a survey done in a dry season decades ago, of lines that the public might have misread. "It's only paper," he said with an easy smile, "and sometimes paper gets lost or the wind takes it." The men at the table laughed and the women bowed their heads to the stew. The laughter was not cruel. It was the humor of those who saw a dispute as a story to be told rather than a wound to tend. Boaz, who had been at the far end of the table, kept his plate on his knee and said nothing. Abigail noticed the way his hand tightened on the fork once, so slight she might have missed it if she had not been watching him like a woman counting the beat of a heart. Days later, a rider came through town with a letter. Blackwood's lawyer had placed a claim on Boaz's northern pasture. The sheriff wrote of a legal challenge to the fence line and requested that Boaz produce deeds at the next county meeting. The paper said everything a man could say about ink and signatures without revealing what he was thinking. Abigail read the letter beside the stove with her fingers pricked to the edges of the paper. Her first thought was practical. Did they have the deeds? Where were they kept? And then, because she had read about men who took what they wanted with paper first and force later, her stomach folded inward. She thought of the small raw ledger that had been her father's and then her own, a book of names, of debts paid and seeds bought, a book you kept under lock and sometimes under your pillow for lack of trust in the world. It occurred to her that documents could be not only proof, but also the shroud under which men hide wickedness. Boaz met with the neighbors. There were calm conversations and a couple of raised voices. There were men in boots leaning on the fence, arguing over the meaning of a meets and bounds description. Marcus Blackwood visited the Cutter place twice and kept his hat in his hands like a man who wished to show respect, but also wished, in the same breath, to be noticed for being noticed. Abigail watched him from the kitchen window when she could, the edge of the curtain making her a frame. He waved a polite hand. He had a smile and a watch that caught the sun in a way that suggested money. The fact that he was pleasant made Abigail's skin pucker. She had judged men like that before. They had a habit of reducing other people's certainties into things they could sign and sell. The town divided itself along small, practical lines. Some said let the law sort it. Others said you could not trust a paper unless the witness was named and honest. Mrs. Patterson fretted by the stove and told Abigail that someone ought to keep a closer eye on deeds, Potter's deeds, which had always been a bit loose. Reverend Matthews said, from the pulpit, that truth would come out if folks did their duty.
Such pronouncements comforted those whose trust was easy. Abigail felt in the course of those weeks the old smallness of rumor press against them. She found herself making lists at night, where the deeds had been stored, who had last handled them, what witnesses might still be alive to swear to a document's veracity. Her ledger of the school, neat and stiff-lipped, became a place where she kept track of names and dates and the small chain of custody that meant everything in a frontier life. A farmer named Harlan suggested they go to the county seat to produce the deeds, but Boaz, who loved the land, the patience that had been honed by seasons of drought and flood, said he would look for other evidence before they rode the many miles. "We don't get the whole town upended if we can hold the fence," he said. His voice contained a kind of stubborn hope. There was principle in keeping a fence where you had set it. He meant also to spare Abigail the spectacle. She felt the gratitude like a warm cloth under the stove. Once in the quiet between tending the garden and dusting the shelves of the parlor, Abigail found a small thing that tightened the throat. She had borrowed a ledger from the community hall, a cattle book kept by generations of ranchers, pages full of names and brands and the terse notation of who sold to whom. It was the sort of book you read as one reads the margin of a town's life, and Abigail used it to check dates and names. While she read, a slip of paper, folded into the spine like a pressed leaf, fell loose and slid across the table. She picked it up and smoothed the crease.
It was a page torn from some other ledger, the handwriting practiced and careful, and at the edge of it was a notation that did not quite belong, a description of lines and bounds that matched the north pasture but used names she did not recognize. For a moment she thought it was an error, a misfiled page, a clerk's mistake, a trivial wrong thing. But there was a certain precision to the notation, and the ink used was the same as that found in other documents that tied Blackwood's name to many lands. Abigail set it aside, wrapped it in cloth, and kept it under her slate box. She did not show anyone at first. To point and claim is a thing that takes both evidence and courage. She had neither in abundance. Boaz noticed, though, that she was quieter at night, and the thing had a way of sitting between them like a small stone. He asked once what lay heavy on her. "It's only a scrap," she said, not wanting to name the rising shadow. "A page that, well, it might be nothing." Boaz did not press. He was a man who trusted facts as much as he trusted the taste of his soup. Both told him what to do. He watched the horizons, he watched the fences, and he watched whatever it was that made Abigail's fingers fidget at the table when she thought she was alone. The land itself seemed to lean toward conflict. The north pasture lay like a pale thing beyond the fence, the grass thinner, the earth scarred by winter. From the porch of the Cutter house, one could watch the sun move over the line where cattle had grazed for a generation. It is the way of prairie life that fences mark what men swear to protect, and sometimes men are only a measurement of how well they keep their fences. Marcus Blackwood's skiers were sometimes seen close to the barbed wire, and Blackwood himself would ride the line at dusk as if to remind everyone that his was a presence that measured width and ownership with a smile. Abigail found herself drawn sometimes to the window by the stove, the old pocket watch that had been her father's across the table like a small, patient thing. She would lay a hand on the watch and listen to its ticking, an ordinary sound that kept time even as the world suggested otherwise. It made her calm. It made her think in increments, find a fact, gather a witness, prepare for whatever the law might demand. She also found that she could not be merely a woman who wrote down facts. When Blackwood's loader for hire men lingered on the ridge and the sheriff's replies came back slow, there was a rustle of unease that the town felt like a fever. Abigail grew restless in ways that surprised her. She had been content to teach, to sweep, to plant and gather and keep the ledger in its proper place. But a life on a ridge does not suffer passive people for long. The wind pushes one to stand or be listened to. The thing that steadied her was the bell. Not every danger requires a rifle. Some require that you call the town, and call it cleanly. She polished the little school bell until it chimed bright and clear, and when dusk came, she would ring it for reasons that were not emergencies, to remind herself that its tone could carry across the fields, to practice a signal, to hang the habit of calling onto her hands. Boaz watched her once stand on the porch and ring it twice, in as mild a tone as she could, then once more, the sound silver and difficult on the air. "Why do you make the bell sing?" he asked. "I want to know it will be there when I need it," she said. "A sound must have a tune you can trust."
He came closer and did a thing that startled her more than the world's troubles did. He took the bell from her hand and said with a small, rueful patience, "Then you'll be the one to ring it." She nodded, because in the end, the bell had always been hers. She had kept the sound for her students, and it was not for a man's ownership to take. That winter, the first sign that things would not settle into a quiet order came in the form of a letter returned unread. A county clerk, writing from the seat of government, put in weary ink that certain surveys required new witnesses, and that men must appear at the sheriff's office within 30 days, or the claim might stand as unchallenged. There was a practicality in such words that made Abigail's chest feel like a taut drum. Boaz swore once under his breath, the words small and private, and then he began to prepare. He gathered neighbors to speak plainly. He mended fences where the wind had torn the wire, and he counted bolts and nails with the calm industry of a man who had been given a thing to do and would do it well. Abigail watched him and learned the stoic map of his mind. Start with work, then talk. Fill the house with the ordinary so that the extraordinary had no foothold. The extraordinary, however, is persistent. Marcus Blackwood's presence did not retreat. He began to attend meetings at the hotel where cattlemen met, and he was always at the edge of the card table, playing at easy smiles that slipped into sharp remarks when he thought himself safe. He asked about surveys again and again, as if he were merely curious about the land itself, and every time he did, Abigail felt the air in the parlor thicken like steam under a lid. When spring bent the ridge into a less severe shape and the thin shoots of green appeared, Abigail found herself doing something she had never expected to do. She went out to the shed and asked Boaz to show her how to load his rifle. Her hands shook the first time he set the cartridge into place, not from fear of the weight, but from the enormity of choosing to be, in some small way, ready for a man who might try to take what was not his. Boaz stood behind her, patient, and guided her fingers. He did not treat her as delicate. He treated her as a person learning a craft.
He showed her how to breathe, how to steady her elbow on the sill of the porch, how to take the sight with the thickness of incident rather than with the thinness of drama. The rifle was a sober thing, heavy in its simplicity. Abigail surprised herself in the way the butt fit her shoulder, and how the line of sight asked for only the steadying of breath and the will to stay in place. "You don't have to shoot if you don't want," Boaz said once, finally, as if he were speaking of church matters. "But you can. It's a fact. Keep your facts close." She took to the work with the same-mindedness she took to sums. It was not hunger for violence that made her learn, but a desire to be useful in a world that measured protection by the swiftness of a response. Learning was to her a way to keep the bell ringing. You prepare, you practice, you make sure that if the day breaks wrong, you can stand and make the sound that calls others to the yard. There were tender mornings, too. They would come into the kitchen with a light that broke across the stove's enamel and read by the window, the dog at Boaz's boots and an open volume between them. Sometimes, when the wind had driven a line of cloud across the sun, he would take her hand in both of his and press his knuckle to the soft place at the base of her thumb. There was silence in that, no speech, just a small ceremony of habit. Abigail found it, without choosing to be enough at times, small moments that told a new story without any trumpets. The town's talk rolled on like a slow creek. Some were wary, some indifferent, and some began quietly to place their sympathy on Abigail's side when they noticed how Boaz looked at the north pasture. Mrs. Henderson, who had always kept an eye on propriety, came to the parsonage one afternoon and gave Abigail a stock of preserves, and when she left she touched Abigail's arm and said in a voice made of linen, "If you need any witness to the truth, you know my name." "Thank you," Abigail said, and the gratitude that rose then was not only to Mrs. Henderson, but to a town that, when it could, found ways to be more than rumor. Support is sometimes a small thing, a preserved jar, a named witness, a quiet hand under the table in church. They add up like nails in a fence. Still, the smell of trouble lingered. Abigail felt it in the way cattle stood uneasy at the fence line, in the way Boaz's jaw tightened when he worked his hands at a post. There were nights she woke and listened to the small, cold sounds of the house, as if they might tell her whether the world would hold. Each tick of the pocket watch across the table spelled another measure of time in which men might act. Then one afternoon came a man on a horse with boots that had seen better roads. He rode up to the cutter place and sat his hat on that same desk where Boaz had first displayed the contract. Marcus Blackwood was always polite, and his politeness bore the peculiar shine of practiced civility. He spoke to Abigail with the same honeyed manner he used at the card table, asking how the school children fared and whether the garden had coaxed any luck. "You and Cutter make a fair picture," he said with a small, smooth laugh. "I only hope the papers are in order. It would be a shame for a misdone line to cost a little one her school." Abigail felt the words like a frost under a pane. It was as if Blackwood were offering a gentlemanly concern, while showing he knew precisely where to push a system so something might fall away. She stood. She answered with the civility she had taught 100 times. "We keep what we can, Mr. Blackwood. If the law calls, we will answer." He tipped his hat and left with the slow, certain stride of a man who had not yet had to risk anything in truth. Abigail watched him till the dust he'd raised dwindled into a ribbon on the road. The pocket watch lay between her fingers. She wound it and felt the steadying pull into the world of facts. That night, she took the bell down from its hook. She wrapped it in cloth and placed it on the table. When she slept, it was with an odd sense of readiness, as if by setting the bell on the table she had made room for it in her hands, made it a companion like any other. Boaz slept beside her, a sound thing, and in the morning he would speak of fences and of witnessing deeds, and Abigail would find she could name the work she must do next: gather witnesses, find the papers, check the old books. She did not know on that cold dawn that the true test would not be papers alone, but the way a man like Blackwood could tie the threads of rumor into acts, and how a town could be either a cord that holds or a rope that slips. She only knew that she had signed a line that gave her shelter, and that she had taken up a bell she might need to ring. When the first men who came to measure the north pasture rode out from Blackwood's direction, their boots dull with gravel, and their eyes set somewhere beyond courtesy, Abigail stood on the porch with Boaz at her side. The ridge spread away into a lean, honest horizon. She felt as if she stood at the top of a map and could name each place with the steadiness she had learned over years: the creek, the charred stump of the old pine, the fence post that had once been her father's. Boaz took her hand then, in a small, almost imperceptible squeeze, like the closing of a book. "We'll make sure the paper matches the land," he said. "We'll make sure our witnesses speak true." Abigail nodded, and the bell at the schoolhouse waited on her table like a promise. It had a sound she knew how to make. She had practiced until the tone was bright and would carry. If the town needed to be called, she would call it. If a man needed to be told the truth, she would stand and tell it. The first part of the year bent toward action in inches. Letters to lawyers, balances tallied, neighbors consulted, and under it all, the slow gathering of a small cadre who would stand at the fence if needed. Abigail wrote names into her ledger and crossed others off as not yet seen. She kept the scrap of paper she had found in the cattle book in a drawer beneath the ledger, and sometimes, when the room felt too thin with thought, she would pull it out and touch the corner as if the paper might persuade her by being rubbed. She went to the shed one morning to practice loading and unloading until the action was as familiar as brushing a pan. Boaz watched and instructed with the economy of a man who taught by showing. He did not diminish her by the lesson. He amplified her capacity to meet whatever might come. She found a steadiness in the rifle's weight that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the ability to act. When the sheriff's notice finally arrived to say that Blackwood had filed an official claim, Abigail felt a dry sort of thunder under her ribs. It was a legalistic thunder, a notice, a date, a time in the county seat that could mean a day of arguments and voices and dust. The town hummed with the news. People came to the Cutter porch and spoke in low bursts. "It will be a thing settled with ink," said one. "You go to court and you make the law feel the right of you." "It will be taken," said another, with a mean certainty. "Mark my words." Abigail did not let either of those voices sway her. The bell was under the table, the scrap in her drawer, and the pocket watch kept its patient ticking. She made her lists and put the names of possible witnesses in a neat line: Harlan, Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, Reverend Matthews. She knew witness was not the same as power, but it was what she had in a world that measured disputes by what could be sworn. Weeks folded into the cadence of waiting. She taught in the morning, tended the garden in the afternoon, sharpened the bell's tone in the evening. The children asked when she would come home for supper sooner than usual,
and she told them she would be back by dusk. They believed her because their teacher's face had always been a geography of certainty to them. She was the person on whom the town's little future leaned. A single last thing came before the matter reached the point where papers would meet men in court. It was a letter from an old clerk in a neighboring county who had been asked, at the sheriff's request, to look into some records. The letter was small and neat, but its contents had the slow, stacked weight of truth. The clerk wrote that he had found old copies of a survey and that the lines did not tally with the document Blackwood now presented. There were discrepancies, he said. There were awkward margins. He would be willing to testify if the county clerk in Redfern Ridge could arrange his presence.
Abigail read the letter twice, and for the first time in many weeks, she felt a lightness that was not unconnected to relief and something like triumph. The ledger, the bell, the scrap of paper, all the small, attentive acts she had performed were edging the world toward a daylight where facts might be honored. Outside, a wagon rolled by, and the sun bent on its metal with a clean, indifferent glare. Abigail wound the pocket watch and slid the letter into her dress. Boaz put a hand on her shoulder, the motion of a man who had seen seasons and knew how they turned. "We'll see it through, Abigail," he said. There was no flourish in his speech, only the steady certainty of a man who offered shelter by doing the work. She believed him. Yet even with the clerk's letter, the Ridge retained a sense of impending trial. People who wanted something do not always surrender to fact. Paper can be forged, witnesses can be paid, men can take their chances when the law is a distant engine. Abigail had not forgotten the slip of paper she had found before, the notation folded in a cattle book. She kept it, decided now to take its presence as an invitation rather than a threat. Too much in this life was given to worry. She would practice, she would gather witnesses, she would make a plan should polite measures fail. The horizon seemed to hold its breath then, as if the land itself knew that a contest was coming, not of soldiers or banners, but of men and their signatures, of a town and its courage. Abigail set the bell on the table beside her ledger and thought how strange it was to keep something small and true in a world that liked to rearrange facts. She rested her fingers on the bell's rim and felt the metal cool beneath her skin. It made her think of the way a sound can be a promise and a warning both. If this story finds you somewhere beyond the Ridge, tell us where you're listening from. There are pockets of prairie in many hearts, and every town keeps its own bell. The next weeks moved with a tightness, as if a cord had been drawn around the town and slowly tightened. The county clerk's letter had brightened the road ahead, but it did not stop the ways men try to make law an art of persuasion. Marcus Blackwood increased his visits to town. He arrived at the hotel with men whose faces did not belong to Redfern Ridge. His voice softened in public, and the words he left behind were practiced as seed. He wrote letters that sounded courteous and sent receipts and copies, and references to surveys that had been done in seasons of heat and drought, when ink could be bought cheap and witnesses could be brief. Abigail kept her ledger and her lists. She visited the county seat only once to deliver the clerk's note and to speak, plain and careful, with a deputy who smelled of cigar smoke and business. She learned how to fold a letter so that it held its honesty. She watched how men in town looked at her stitches of evidence like they were reading a map. When the sheriff's deputy said, politely, that Blackwood had made a good argument on paper, Abigail found the air between her ribs thin. She read the paper stick he handed her, and then met his eyes. "We'll bring witnesses, Mr. Calloway," she said. "We have dates and names, and a clerk in a neighboring county who'll swear what he found." The deputy nodded, as if he had heard the kind of determination that matters in court. "Bring your witnesses to the county when called," he said, "and keep your papers close. Men will look for holes." Boaz spent the days doing the work that steadied him, mending a post, checking the herd, counting nails. At night, he came into the kitchen and sat at the table where the bell lay wrapped in cloth. Sometimes he would trace the margin of Abigail's contract with the flat of his hand and say nothing. Sometimes he would take the pocket watch and wind it carefully, as if winding the world back into a kinder season. One dusk, when the sky had been stripped to a thin bruise and the first stars pricked at the cold, a man rode up to the porch more hurried than was polite. He was out of breath, and his hat sat forward like a man who had rushed to be heard. Miss Wyn," he panted. "There's men tonight. I seen 'em leaving Blackwood's. They were not honest faces. They were hired men, if you can believe it." Abigail did not startle. She had learned to keep the pulse of what fright can do to a mind that must stay practical. She wiped the rim of the bell with her sleeve and set it on the table, then looked at Boaz. "We'll call the town if they come," he said. "We'll not let them steal a pasture by night." "Not steal," Abigail corrected. "Take what they believe they can mark as theirs. Paper makes a map of intent. Men make a map of action." Boaz agreed with a brief nod, as if to honor both the map of paper and the map of muscle. They made a plan that was part law, part neighborly measure.
Abigail wrote the names of those who would come to their yard if the school bell rang the way they had agreed. She thought of the bell's sound cutting across stubble, and that it might bring people who would not think of themselves as soldiers, but who would think of themselves as neighbors. Training intensified in small, private ways. Abigail took to the porch before dawn to practice loading until her hands could do it without thinking. She practiced until the motion lived like the way she used to write a chalk stroke. Boaz showed her how to keep the rifle clean and how to move the weight from foot to foot so that if the need came, she would not be surprised by the recoil. They practiced signals. 1 ring meant call the neighbors, 3 meant immediate alarm, 2 a warning. Abigail liked the logic of it. She liked that a signal could be a code of civility in a world that sometimes spoke only with force. When the first threat came, it arrived thin and careful.
A parcel of Blackwoodsmen rode close to the north fence at dusk and left no trace but hoofprints in the field. They cut a single wire of the barbed fence and moved on, as if to say they could be careful about appearances and also make the point. Abigail found the cut the next morning, and when she did, she felt the skin of the world underfoot tighten. She picked up the wire and held it as if it were a question. "We'll mend it," Boaz said. "We'll mend it now. We'll make it clear such things won't happen without noise." They did mend it, and neighbors helped. Harlan with his broad shoulders, 2 men from the north with their hands full of barbs, and a thin young man who had once been awkward in Abigail's class, but who now drove a nail with a steadier hand than his age suggested. The town showed up in pieces, reluctant and proud, and they hammered the wire with small satisfaction, as if to say, "Fences mark what we keep, and some things are kept because we will keep them." Blackwood's retort was quieter and, at first, more insidious. He began to spread the suggestion that perhaps Abigail's scrap of paper had been misread, that old clerks confused some things in their ledgers, that witnesses sometimes remembered wrongly after years. He paid a rumor to a man in the store and a kind word to a woman at the church supper, and let small doubts seep like dye into cloth. The county clerk's letter gave them ground, but Blackwood's oil of insinuation pushed at it. It was on a late morning, while she taught, that Abigail felt the room change tone. She glanced at the door and saw a man standing there, a stranger to the school and to the children's eyes. He had a practiced face and a watch that flashed like Blackwood's. He gave her a card, not in law but in manner, a messenger with an invitation that read like a threat. The card bore a name she did not know and an ask to speak alone with Miss Wyn that afternoon. She closed the school with the direction in her manner that the children knew and sent them home with spelling lists. When the door was shut and the sun cut the chalk dust in square light across the floor, she took the visitor's note and put it in her pocket like a small, unnatural stone. "That man is a courier for Blackwood," she told Boaz that evening when she showed him the card. "He asked when I might see him about details he could deliver. It felt like a hand in a glove." Boaz did not like the image, his face closed. "We answer tough with truth," he said. "We don't invite talk that smells of threat." He set about drafting a reply which was equal parts courtesy and refusal, and they decided that they would not see any emissaries alone again. The hour when menace shaped itself into menace came on a windless dusk. Abigail had been sweeping the school porch and thinking of how the children would need her the next day for sums, for the sound of the bell, for the small order of learning to make. She had wrapped the bell in cloth to keep the sound from tarnish when a rider came, not from Blackwood's direction, but from the road toward town, with the speed of someone fleeing news. "Miss Wyn," the rider called, jangling his reins. "It's Harlan. Folks are saying Blackwood's men will be out tonight. They say they'll be coming to the Cutter place to examine the line." Abigail's hands stilled against the broom. The light in the west was gone, and as they hurried back toward the house, she could see the horizon flatten like a drawn blade. They moved with the efficiency of a pair who had practiced. Abigail wrapped the bell and set it on the table. Boaz took the rifles from their pegs and checked the cartridges. She checked the spare bandolier and the little leather pouch that held extra caps. They did not speak much, because words in the face of a possible violence can be like splinters. Instead, they moved. Neighbors came in small groups. The woman with the preserves brought 2 men. Harlan came with a thick-armed brother. The school's awkward young man arrived with an axe in his hands, as if he had something to defend other than the earth. The porch filled with men who had not been soldiers, but who now had the gravity of citizens gathered to hold the line. They arranged themselves in the yard and sat on crates and leaned on fence posts. Abigail found the bell in its wrappings and unrolled it. She wiped it again with a clean cloth and tested the ring. It sounded clear and far-reaching. Boaz stood near the door with his rifle and gave a low count of the men. He did not look at Abigail with anything like tenderness. His expression was too used to handling danger, but the way his hand rested near her back as if to measure distance made her feel like a partner in something necessary, rather than a thing being kept. Night fell thick without warn. An hour after supper, the shadow of men appeared on the road, Blackwood's men, lit by the wavering light of lanterns, some with faces cut to cold intent, one with a scar along his jaw. Blackwood himself did not lead them. He meant it to be a distance between himself and the act, like a man who signs other men's checks. The hired hands came with the spring in their step of paid workmen who had not yet been tested by a town's sense of boundary. They came to the fence and stopped at a measured distance, then called in voices that would have been courteously threatening had such a phrase existed. "We've come to examine the line," one said. "We'll do nothing you don't ask. No harm, no trouble," another voiced with practiced blandness. Boaz answered firmly, and Abigail rang the bell once as planned, 2 calls to warn, 1 to call the chown. The sound slid across the fields like a blade of light. From other yards came the thud of steps. Men who had been reluctant came with the weight of duty. People knew the sound of a bell as a wake-up and a call. They came not as a trained army, but as a community that would not give ground easily when their own sounded. The air tightened into a moment of risk. Blackwood's men advanced around the fence as if to encircle, and then the first shot broke the night. It was not a long volley at first. A rifle bit the air, and the world held in the metallic cord of it. Abigail felt the sting of the sound as if someone had struck her cheek. She had practiced for this. She had not imagined the lurch of fear that accompanied the first crack. The children's faces, they had been asleep, but Abigail imagined their slumber shattered, and the bell's tone still ringing in her ears unfolded the scale of what they faced. There was gunfire in the dark and the smell of gunpowder. Abigail called the names of neighbors as if to lay them out as a map. She saw men ducking and heard the thump of a boot hitting the earth. Boaz moved like a man who had spent seasons watching storms form. He did not waste breath. He stepped, he took position, and he fired at a man advancing near the fence. The fight was sudden and close. The night sparkled with the brief flashes of muzzle and panic. Abigail found her feet as if they were a work she had been taught to do. She took position in the window by the stove, Boaz had insisted, and the sight held as a small aperture to the outside. She steadied the rifle on the sill and breathed like he had taught her. Her first shot landed, and a man fell back, gurgling. Not an image to glamorize, but a fact to reckon with. Abigail felt the shock of the act like a cold wind. She was not proud of the wound, but she knew the wound had kept a man's intent from closing. She lowered the rifle, as if to worship at the way it had kept something from happening. On the porch, Boaz grappled with one of Blackwood's men who had leapt the fence with the quickness of someone who thinks a short climb will be unnoticed. The 2 men wrestled as if in a barn, each move a negotiation of weight and will. Abigail saw Boaz's jaw set. She saw the flash of something that frightened her in its depth, an old thing in him that might have once sought vengeance and not justice. He had the man down, hand at the throat, the glint of a knife near his fingers. For a breath, Abigail feared he would cross a line she did not want to see crossed. She remembered then the long, straight clauses of the contract and the way they had promised a separation of beds and a preservation of school. She remembered the small mercy that had made her keep the bell. She thought of the law they would all answer to. Without thinking of mercy as a slogan, but rather as a practice, she stepped forward and caught the wooden handle of Boaz's forearm and brought it down. "Boaz," she said, and the name was not an order, but a recall. He looked at her as if at a lit match. The world tilted, and then he drew back like a man who had remembered the promise he had offered on inked paper. He gripped the man's wrist and cuffed it into a knot of leather. The hired man coughed, spat, then quieted. The night smelled of cold and iron, and the thing that had been nearly born, not revenge, died in the quiet. The town had taken positions around them. A blunt-armed farmer stood by the cart and met a man whose gun had jammed. A neighbor pushed a rider off his horse and dragged him in with the gentleness of a man who knew how to hold a person without breaking his bones. Abigail saw Blackwood at the edge of the lantern light, not among his men, but not far, his hands in his pockets like a man waiting to see what had been tested. Then Blackwood made a move that would mark him. He strode toward the porch with a smile that had always sounded like an auctioneer. He stepped as if the atmosphere were his own, and the town's bodies merely scenery. "You made a show of it," he said, smooth as oil. "It's a pity men must give rise to such noise over a paper, but I commend you for keeping your woman safe."
Boaz stood between him and Abigail like a fence post. Abigail's hand rested on the bell, a small, heavy thing. She thought of how a bell could be a weapon of sound and a thing to be thrown. The thought arrived and settled like a second, quick instrument in the night. "You'll answer for those hired hands," Boaz said, voice low. Blackwood laughed, and it was too calm. "Answer to whom? To the sheriff? To your neighbors? Men make declarations on nights like this, Mr. Cutter, and sometimes the law only reads one margin. We shall see which holds ink and which holds grit." Abigail could feel a small, hot coil in her chest. She wanted the ground to swallow him and his smile. Instead, she took the bell in both hands and swung it downward in a long, practiced arc. The bell struck across a man's temple, one of Blackwood's more aggressive henchmen who had crept toward the porch, and the lamp went out under his head. The man did not die. He simply toppled backward like a felled hay bale, the light of his lantern rolling away. That single action made a space in which the town moved as one. Men grabbed the fallen. Others took the two who had been grappling near the gate and twisted their hands behind their backs. Someone tied a rope. Blackwood tried to reach for the horses, but Harlan was there and tripped him with a swift motion. Blackwood fell into the dirt with an expression of pure surprise. By the time the sheriff, roused from his bed by the bell's sound and the neighbors' shouts, arrived with a lamp and a sense of official weight, the hired men were bound, and one of them sat with a cloth on his brow, breathing hard. Blackwood was held seated on a wagon wheel like a man in a court of ruin. "You'll take them to the county," the sheriff said, as if reading from a ledger of obligations.
His voice had the small crackle of someone whose authority is strict, but who knows fragility when he sees it. "It will be done," Boaz said. He smelled of sweat and spent force. Abigail saw the way his hands trembled slightly as he lowered them from where they had been knotted in the struggle. There was a fatigue that had not been there before. She had known him as a man who measured his actions, but tonight he had measured himself against something that came too near cruelty. Abigail's hand found his and squeezed it like a compass. Blackwood, however, was not arrested in the moment. He was allowed by the small machinery of law and influence and the fact that he had not been visibly armed in the same way, to be taken into custody later. The men who had come to him were handed over to the sheriff and to the county's care, but Blackwood's role as instigator could not be so cleanly boxed away. Evidence needed time to gather. Witnesses needed letters and signatures and accounts that could be sworn. At the county seat the next week, testimony was taken in a limited and precise way. The hired men gave their names and the dates of their pay. A thin, embarrassed one offered details that did not help his employer so much as convict the method of paid escalation. The clerk from the neighboring county testified as though reading from an honest heart, and his hand at the podium did not falter. Harlan, Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, each gave their witness in a voice that held the clean tone of people who knew the value of truth and the cost of telling it. Abigail went to the court to speak. She did not dress like rhetoric. She wore her Riverstone dress, the same one she had worn at the wedding. She pinned a sprig of wild aster at her throat because it had been given to her in the hard season, and because small comforts matter. When she stood, she told the story of the scrap of paper she had found in the cattle book, the creak of its margins, the clerk in the neighboring county's letter, and the timeline she had kept in her ledger. She spoke in a voice that layered facts one upon the next until they built a clear line. "You will see," she said simply, "that the deed presented by Mr. Blackwood cannot stand without witnesses who saw it signed in right time. The paper that ties the North Pasture to his name has ink that does not match the ledger that has been kept by this town for a generation." The judge, a man slow with the authority of his chair, listened. Blackwood's counsel was practiced in the art of dilution, little questions that turned facts into threats, until the clerk was asked to hold a copy of the paper up and be questioned closely. The clerk did so, and when the ink's peculiarities were examined, it unraveled into evidence of forgery, a scrawl not matching the hand of the original survey, a margin added after the fact, witness signatures that, upon inquiry, traced to men who were not present at the supposed time. When pressed, one of Blackwood's hired hands, perhaps moved by conscience, perhaps by the fear of the rope, began to talk in slurred, halting sentences. What he said was not a grand confession, but a sensible list. Blackwood had acquired men, he had paid them to harass fences, He had had documents drawn that bore convincing signatures, but which had been, at best, illegally procured. He refused, in the end, to speak for acts of murder. He would, however, confirm that he had seen a ledger with the wrong lines, and that the money for the work had come from the Blackwood house. Such admissions are small storms in the law. They swing pendulums of suspicion. The judge took the pieces and let them sit with a practical mind. Marcus Blackwood was cautious in court, smiling when polite, tight when pressed, and his counsel tried to bury an obvious seam in the conversation under legal corners. But one night, when the town had gone to bed and the county's lights were dimmed, Blackwood visited the courthouse clerk and offered him a purse with enough money to hush certain files. The clerk, a man with a small conscience, took the coin and faltered. He told his wife, and in a trembling conscience, that night he marched himself to Reverend Matthews and confessed the attempted bribery. Reverend Matthews, who had a way of weighing things outside the court, took the clerk's statement with a quiet solemnity and sent word to the sheriff's office. When such a thing, bribery, comes into the air, it smells like an admission. The sheriff moved, and the fact that Blackwood had tried to suborn truth made the town less inclined towards his innocence. It is one thing to buy men to write at night. It is another to try and buy the record of law itself. The town's sense of rightness tightened into a focus. In the end, evidence and conscience met in a way that pushed the case forward. The county found the forgeries, the clerk's testimony held, and the mouths of hired men described a plan that had the stench of premeditation. In court, witnesses under oath spoke plainly and with the measured terror of folks who remember what fear will do to a town. The thing that was most damning was that Blackwood had not only attempted to press a false claim on paper, he had tried to manufacture the very mechanisms of truth. Abigail watched during the trial with a hands-clasped steadiness. She did not gloat when Blackwood's face found new lines of worry. She had wanted from the first for the law to act, not for personal vengeance. She wanted truth to be proven, because truth, in the end, is the thing that gives a town a next season. When the jury returned and the verdict named Marcus Blackwood guilty of forgery and perjury and incitement, the town filed out of the courthouse with an odd, hollow victory. The consequences were not small. The judge, with an old sense of law's gravity, instructed a sentence that included the possibility of execution for complicity in violent acts.
The moral weight of such a sentence falls on communities like a long, cold wind. It asks whether vengeance and justice are different, whether a town wants to show force or to show law. There were those who loved the boldness of a noose for a man they thought worse than the rope could hold. There were others who felt the gravity of a human life in the balance and found no exact comfort. Reverend Matthew said in a sermon that was careful and quiet that the law had to run its course and that people must be sober about the judgment they meted. He prayed for the county to do right and for the town to hold its humanity as it held its fences. Marcus Blackwood, when the hour of sentencing came, appeared as a man whose charm had been stripped. He tried to speak in his own defense and failed at the small theater of remorse. The town listened and felt, in varying degrees, the satisfaction of one who sees a lie fall. The hired men were sentenced differently, some to gallows, some to lesser terms and fines, the county making distinctions between those who beat Nat and those who wielded scythe. Abigail held the bell in her hands one afternoon when the execution was scheduled. She had never liked the hangman's logic, but she had not wanted a man who would buy and sell law to roam free. She had thought, over nights of sleeplessness, of the father whose death had been whispered about in the town, Boaz's father's accident that had, to some, always smelled of too convenient timing. She had not wanted to assail a man without proof. She had wanted the town to make its decision with eyes open. The morning of the execution was clear and merciless. People gathered, not as an amusement, but as a civic act. Blackwood's face in the stand was stripped to the lines of a man who had misread the margin between ambition and criminality. There is not much to say of an execution that honors the living more than the dead. It is a hollowizing ritual. Reverend Matthews offered a prayer that was not triumphal, but mournful for the waste of a life used for greed. Boaz did not attend the execution. Abigail knew why. He had not wanted to see a man leave the world in such a measured way, and perhaps he feared that the sight would loosen something in him like a broken fence. Instead, he stayed with her in the Cutter house and sat in the chair by the stove, the pocket watch in his hand. They oversaw the house as if to mark that life, though it had the grief of action, went on. After all the legal laboring of words and witnesses, after the county wrote its verdict in the land's ledger, and its people took their varied stances, the ridge exhaled. Yet the town was not the same. Violence leaves a record in bones and in sleep. Abigail saw the tremor in Boaz's drinking of his coffee, a slight quicker movement in his hands when he worked posts.
She felt the small quiver when she wound the watch and heard the rhythm that told her he was present.
They did what towns do to heal. They got the hedges in and repaired the schoolhouse's broken clapboard and coaxed the seasons into their work. Abigail returned to the school with a steadier tread and taught sums and the times of things. The children came back to her ledger with the same trust they had always shown, and the bell sounded, no longer only a weapon, but a call to the ordinary. She kept the scrap of paper, the bell, and the pocket watch, like talismans of a time when facts mattered. The months that followed were tender in ways that surprised them both. Abigail's belly showed faint lines that she kept secret for a time, hiding them under her apron when neighbors came. She and Boaz held a simple conversation one evening after supper, leaning toward the stove like two people who share a quiet plot. "It'll be a good name," Boaz said, "something that keeps the memory of steadiness about us." Abigail thought of names like one thinks of seeds. She liked Samuel for its soft dignity, but she held the idea lightly, as if it could shift. They argued, not in high voice, but in the slow barter of those who are making a family out of days. At night, Abigail would sometimes feel the baby move, and the quiet joy of the movement was like a note from the future. The town, which had been quick to whisper when things were uncertain, was slower now to judge. There was pity and forgiveness in many hands, and in others a cautious respect for what Abigail had done. People who had frowned now nodded with an ease that acknowledged both their error and the good sense Abigail had always shown. Mrs. Henderson visited with a new jar of preserves, and the banker's wife came to the parsonage one afternoon with a small shawl she had knit. Support is not the thundering heroism some make it. It is a steady string of small things. Boaz was not transformed into a minstrel. He remained blunt and honest and a few words. But he began, in ways that mattered, to show his tenderness not as an aside, but as practice. He read to Abigail sometimes, awkwardly but with intent, and he placed a small silver band on Abigail's finger one morning as she handed him a stew ladle. She did not announce it. She wore it like a private coin. It symbolized not ownership, but a shared boundary, the sort of small covenant that is more practical than poetic. When the time came for Abigail to teach again, she did so with a quiet that was firm. She kept the school's ledger safe in a drawer. She taught the children how to write their names, and how to keep their promises, as if promises were a matter of measurement as important as sums. She taught them how to ring the bell, too, the correct sequence for calling neighbors in a time of need, something no one had taught her as a child, but which she thought practical to give. Boaz watched the little life that grew in her stomach like a season he could not measure except by love.
The couple planted a garden, rows of carrots and beans laid like neat sentences, and Abigail taught him to weave a cornstalk braid for storing the harvest. The pocket watch was wound and filed in a box, where sometimes, when the work was done, they would sit and listen to its small, patient ticking. On the morning Samuel was born, the world felt as if it had been mended in a seam Abigail had not known was open. She held the child and felt the smallness of his fist wrapping around one of her fingers. He had a cry like the wind, and in that first sound the house filled with the honest clutter of a life that would learn to be persistent and kind. Boaz stood nearby with the humility of a man who had put his hands into the soil and found gold in quietness. He had said, once in the beginning, "I need a wife. You need strong sons to guard your winters." And now he stood, looking at the child with a slow tenderness that widened his face. They named him Samuel, for steadiness and for a name that felt like a ledger of the future. The town came by, as towns do in these times, to bring pies and to meet the child who had changed the Cutter household script. Mrs. Henderson brought a crocheted blanket with little blue stars, and even old men who had scowled at Abigail's marriage found a way to bring eggs or a hunk of meat. The years that followed moved with the careful work of a hand mending a fence. Abigail taught while she nursed Samuel between lessons, and Boaz found ways to be at the school occasionally so that the child could watch his father mend posts. The town's gossip diminished into a sort of affection. People were kinder around the pair because they had seen them through heated nights and law. The contract in the drawer became not a tool of necessity, but a relic of a beginning that had been honest. They kept its clauses and sometimes laughed at the thought of separate beds. There were mornings when Abigail thought of the bell and the bite of the ridge in winter, and how a small sound could gather a town close as a stitch gathers cloth. She would ring it sometimes just to remind herself that a certain sound could call people to the yard, and that a call could bring neighbors who would not let the lights go out too soon.
Boaz, in a voice that had stopped being only blunt and had grown a softness that matched the years, spoke to Abigail on a slow evening when Samuel had fallen asleep across her lap, and the stove gave off a comfort like a hearth city. "You were right about the bell," he said. "You were right about keeping your name and calling the tune." Abigail smiled and traced the line of the pocket watch. "You were right about the fence," she returned. "You were right about making me a place to stand." He laughed then, a small sound that belonged to a man who had learned to measure nights differently. "So perhaps the bargain had bile in the beginning," he said, referring to the blunt line he had first offered at her door.
But the bargain has become something else. I need a wife, and you needed strong sons. But perhaps what we both needed most was a pair of hands to hold another season. She looked at him and saw the way his face softened, the neat tenderness that had come from years of cold and work. She imagined the boy growing in the nursery, the ring of the bell calling him to school, the watch ticking his days into a long, ordinary life. The line Boaz had said in the schoolhouse long ago had been spoken as a practical stroke of necessity, no gilding, no promise of romancing. Yet in the space of that practical stroke, something like a partnership had been built, quiet, sturdy, and steady. It had become love made of timbers rather than song. On a late spring afternoon, Abigail walked with Samuel in her arms to the edge of the ridge where the north pasture met the fence they had defended. Boaz came beside them and took a step closer. The sky was a clear expanse of a color that was like hope kept to earth. Abigail placed the child against the fence and let him feel the texture of the wood and the thatch of grass. The pocket watch ticked in her breast pocket like a small, private metronome. "You keep your bell, Abigail," Boaz said, "half for the child, half for the land. We'll keep our fence." She looked at him, and in the way that the prairie held light, she saw the plainness of the man who had once stood in her doorway and offered that strange and honest sentence. In the passage of seasons, his words had bent into something neither had expected. They had started as a way to protect winters, and have instead shaped a world where a small boy could learn the sound of calling and counting. Abigail took Samuel in her arms and turned toward the house. "We keep our watch too," she said. "We keep what is true, our work and our names." Boaz nodded like a man who knew the value of a short, honest phrase. When they reached the porch, Abigail set the little school bell on the cable and wound the pocket watch. The bell's tone when she tested it was clean and not the sound of a weapon, but of a town that had been recalled to its better self. Later, in the quiet of the kitchen, while the stove hummed and Autumn drafted a plan, Boaz reached across the table and touched Abigail's knuckle the way he had in the older days. "You were never merely a name on a contract," he said softly. "You were the thing that kept a place for all the rest." Abigail answered with the small laugh of a woman who knew what it meant to be both practical and beloved. "And you were never merely a man who wanted sons," she said. "You were a man who could learn tenderness." They sat then in a silence like an exhale, and the pocket watch ticked the soft, inevitable rhythm of a life that had found its shape. Outside, the prairie rolled, and the wind pried at the eaves with a businesslike patience. The bell, tucked beneath a cloth, rested like an answered question. Over the years, their life grew to include more of the town's ordinary things: PTA meetings and a fence mended after a storm, a boy whose curiosity about numbers rivaled Abigail's, and afternoons when Boaz taught Samuel how to count the stars he had once known by name. The county official who had presided over the trial came to the school once, shyly, and praised Abigail's testimony as if presenting a medal. She simply smiled and continued teaching, pointing to the blackboard and drawing a long, straight line that she told the children was the sort of thing you make if you want to measure a thing true. When one winter night a new man came to the schoolhouse and stood in the door as Boaz had once done, Abigail did not flinch. Her hand rested on the bell like a woman whose work was not finished, but who had the sound of a life to call upon. She had known seasons of rumor and nights of fear. She had known the smell of gunpowder and the bitter taste of dealing with men who would barter with the town's law. But she had also known the small mercies that stitch up edges, neighbors who stepped forward, a clerk who told the truth, a husband who learned the shape of tenderness. Boaz's voice, blunt and true, might have said that he needed a wife and she needed sons, but in the quiet after the storm had passed, their relationship had matured into a mutual need that did not strip the other of agency, but rather made both larger. He had learned to trust her judgment, and she had learned to trust his steadiness. The phrase that had once sounded like a plain market exchange had become, over time, a sort of shorthand for what they had: practical, necessary, and then loving. When the town's children grew up and moved on, and when the ledger lay heavier with new names, Abigail and Boaz would sometimes sit on the porch and let the wind change the light on their faces. In those moments, they would talk about the small things that had kept them: the bell, the watch, the contract that had been an honest beginning. They would sometimes repeat the line that had started it all, not as a claim, but as a memory of the place where their lives began to touch. "I need a wife," Boaz said once, in a voice too plain to be tender, and Abigail laughed because she remembered the phrase's bluntness and the almost awkward honesty of it. "You needed sons," she said back, smiling in the way that names the whole of a life. "And you needed someone to keep the house straight." They both understood then how the winters had been guarded, not by sons alone, but by a community whose boundaries they had defended together. The boy Samuel grew up to learn arithmetic and caring, and he learned the sound of the bell first, ringing not as a weapon, but as a call to gather, to sow, to teach.
On the last morning of a long summer, with the ridge bending with heat and the school bells singing bright in the yard, Abigail stood at the doorway where once a giant had stepped through and offered a sentence that changed everything. She looked at Boaz, who filled the doorway in a different way now, not only as a man of season and fence, but as a body that contained laughter and small, steady warmth. He did not need to say the sentence again. In the hush between them, the words were a kind of testament. What starts practical can become something tender if held with honesty and courage. She placed her hand on the bell one last time and felt the cool metal steady her. The sound she made when she called the children in that morning was the same bright tone she had practiced, and it carried across the fields like a promise kept. When the sound faded and the children ran to their desks and the pocket watch ticked its patient beat, Abigail Wyn, who had once been a woman of ledgers and slates, knew that the town's winters would be guarded not just by the suns that might come, but by a partnership that had learned to stand clear and keep the sound. If this story moved you, consider staying for more tales of people who keep their bells and their watch. Subscribe and come back when the next season calls.